Welcome to my workshop review. This is my old television room. It's not particularly big. I'll put the dimensions at the bottom of the screen, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you look in the top left hand corner up here, you can see my name, which is Sean Hughes. So please look up any other films that I've made. You might enjoy them or find them useful. In this particular film, I'm going to give you a tour of the workshop. I personally love watching other people's workshop reviews. I'm always enthused to see how people make use out of small spaces. In addition to that, I also want to concentrate on how you're going to get the maximum amount of usage out of one fixed tool. So when I'm talking about a fixed tool, I'm talking about something which is heavy and bulky and lives in your workshop and it doesn't move because of its size and its shape. So behind me you can see there a hollow chisel mortiser. So that sits on a base that I made, and I'll explain how I've managed to get more than its primary function. I can make it do other things. Same thing goes for the table saw and the router table and also the chop saw. But before we start that, there's some photographs that I want to show you of what this place looked like when I first decided that I was going to abandon it as a television room. So this is my hollow chisel mortiser. For those of you who don't know what a hollow chisel mortiser is, it's basically a machine that can cut square holes. I'll get to that later. But in its current configuration, I've fitted a drill chuck to it, so I can now make this work just like a pillar drill. The advantage of this lever is because it's designed really to be able to pull down and put some major pressure on so that you can actually chisel out holes. It means that it's much easier to use than a normal drill press, which has got a much smaller handle. So if you've got to put some real force on something, you're using maybe a force and a bit, you can get some real purchase on this lever. So I've created a bench for this to sit on. I've bolted this machine to this bench, and then on full extension slides I've got drawers, and everything in this drawer pertains to what goes into that chuck up there. So we've got Forstner bits up here, we've got different types of wood drills, we've got Vix bits, we've got countersinking bits, we've got God knows what. And then in here is a collet that will be used to change that so that we could put back in the original hollow chisel mortising points if we wanted to. The drawer beneath it contains everything that I would use to do with sanding. And finally, we've got two big shelves which are used for storing large jigs. The majority of the jigs in here are bulky and they don't fit anywhere else, so these two shelves are a great home for them. This one here is for the router table, this one here is a toning jig, got a spare vise in there, and just other bits and pieces. Next to the drill press, or the hollow chisel mortiser, we've got the clamp rack. And in order to maximise as much space as possible, on this particular clamp rack, I've got a very long 2 metre level that sits on the side of it. All I needed to do was to put a piece of wood, which is exactly the same size as that aperture there, and that fits neatly and out the way. Lots of little small clamps have been attached to the top in order to use up all the available space. And on the far left hand side, I've got a series of 3 squares. This is a DW745 job site table saw. It's never really meant to be used for fine carpentry, but I find it works well in my small workshop. I was never happy with the height of this table saw, and so I decided to take 3 pieces of MDF, bolt them together, spray them black, and then drill a hole through them so that I could actually add it as a spacer between the base, which it stands on, and the actual chassis of the saw. The idea being that this would make the whole thing higher, obviously, by that thickness. The net effect of that is that I now have a table saw, and I have behind it the router table, and the two are pretty much the same height. So having raised it up now, I find it a much more comfortable height to work at, and the sheer fact that this is now the same height as the router table behind me means that I could use that as an outfeed table. The original stand that this comes on has wheels and a handle so that you can pull it around. I've taken the wheels off it, and I like to use any additional space that I've got here for jigs. So I've got a zero clearance insert there that I've made myself, and this is for obviously a T-square, but it's a nice one, so that fits in there. With space as a premium in a workshop as small as this, I can't afford to waste any space, so this side also has the same thing again. So I think, as most of us know, the primary use of a table saw is with a rip blade fitted and an adjusted fence, is that we can run lengths of timber through and we can change the width of a piece of timber. We can take the same piece of wood and using this slot here and this mitre gauge, we can actually change the length of it as well. So those are two important functions, but they're not the only things that we can do. We can change the height of the blade, we can move the blade over in excess of 45 degrees, but there's a lot more that this little table saw is capable of. And in order to get a secondary function out of this, in order to be able to justify the space that it takes up in the workshop, I want to show you a technique that I've developed where I can actually make this work in conjunction with a stack of blades and cut dados effectively, which is very, very useful. So have a look at this for an idea. If you stare down into the machine, you can see the threaded spline that sticks out directly from the motor, and that is where the blade sits. You'll also notice that if you take a standard blade, you've actually got a very large hole, and that hole doesn't match that shaft. And so what you have here is the standard washer that is applied to that blade before it goes onto the spindle and then is tightened up with the arbor nut there. So in order to stack three blades together, what you need is one of these washers, and that is a special washer that is manufactured specifically to be able to place one of these blades onto one of these threaded spindles. So that fits perfectly on there. There's no movement at all. It's almost like an interference fit. So I can now place that blade directly onto the threaded shaft, being careful that as I slide it across the shaft, I don't actually physically knock it off. So that's good. Now our next blade is a thinner blade. This is a thin kerf blade, and this is the blade that goes in the middle. And because it's a thinner blade, it has a washer. The internal external dimensions are the same, but this time it's a much thinner washer. And this washer fits in exactly the same way. And what we need to do now is to be very cautious and careful when we put this in. And we're going to make this fit directly onto the shaft. Like so. And that just leaves us our last standard blade. So again, flip that over to make sure that we've got the teeth coming towards us. Place on the original blade washer, which has a built-in reduction washer. That now fits over the threaded spline. And as it does, the teeth themselves are automatically at this stage orientated in such a way that they're not touching, because you don't want the carbide teeth to touch. Now, holding that lock together, we take the arbor nut. So that's the amount of arbor nut that is remaining, which is more than enough to hold. So now I'm going to reach down with this and place that on. So with the three blades stacked together, you can see that the two carbide tips from the outside blades don't touch. There's a nice gap between them, and you can see that the thin kerf blade, that isn't touching either. There is clearance all around, and so none of the carbide tips are touching. the insert that comes with it as a standard is perfect for accommodating those 3 blades that we've got in there. So with this setup, I have the ability to now cut box joints. So each one of those cuts is the specific distance which is achieved by putting those 3 blades together. And I'm sure you'll agree that makes a very strong and attractive joint. Here is another example. Using the same system, with the blade raised to a higher height, and this little piece of wood which is cut to fit to exactly the same aperture that is produced when this runs through. If I place that there and this piece of wood up against it, like so, it means that when that wood is removed and that goes through here, it removes all of that wood. At that stage, I can now move that piece of wood over to that pin and now run it again, and it produces that hole. When I now place that freshly cut hole over that pin, that now lines up that, which cuts the second one. And then take it out and repeat the process. So with the same stack of 3 blades, in conjunction with a T-square and a fence, we can produce tenons. The height of the blade determines how high or how thick this tenon is going to be. And where the shoulder of this is determined by how far we set it against the fence. So by running this through several times, we can wear away the material on both sides in order to achieve that effect. When we turn the tenon to its side and we want to cut the cheeks, what we'll need to do is to raise the height of the blade, and with the blade height raised, we can now nibble away the remaining material, and that produces a really accurate tenon. So I showed you on the table saw how we can produce this tenon accurately, so that's good. So in order to achieve a mortise, we'll go back to this machine, which is currently in use as a pillar drill, but this is how we would convert it. Simply by removing this, we can place a collar in here, and that goes up inside here. On the opposing side to this is a bolt that goes through, and we can then put in this hollow chisel mortiser here, and it means that this section remains stationary, and when I provide force on here, this will act effectively as a chisel. Inside is like an auger bit, and if I open up the machine in here, you can see how that auger bit would actually attach in there, and that would cause this to rotate. So the net effect is that you have the ability to cut square holes. So having produced the tenon on the table saw and the mortise on the hollow chisel mortiser, which currently is acting as a drill press, I can put these two together and you can make an extremely attractive and very, very strong joint. A very important part of most workshops that I think is overlooked is extraction. And down here I've got a very powerful little tool that sucks. You can see that there's a couple of wastegates on the left side and the right side here, and this big one here can be shifted off to go to either the table saw or the router table, and the thinner one on this side here can be used for the chop saw. This is the router table, and the router table is no more than an everyday router that's being turned upside down. Underneath here we've got a 1/2-inch DeWalt router. Beneath the router table I've made a drawer that fits into the framework of the router table, and I've also made my own trays, and inside these trays, which are completely removable, are sections of MDF that have been cut with the tool that they sit next to. So that way I can pull a piece of wood out and I can look at it and I can decide whether or not that's going to give me the effect that I want. And I can see the tool right next to it. So this is just a regular router table. So what can we do with a regular router table to turn it into something else? So it's difficult to imagine how I could turn a router into another tool, but I'm going to show you how you can turn a router into effectively a jointer. So this is stage one in turning a router table into a jointing machine. First of all, what you want to do is you want to buy yourself a flush cutting bit. Now this particular flush cutting bit has a bearing on the end of it, and the idea being that if this bearing runs against an obstacle, it will trim anything else in relation to that bearing. Therefore, that bearing and that edge are identical. So if I place that huge router piece in here and tighten it up, and I lower the tool so that it fits underneath the table like that. So the next thing I need to do is I need to make this outfeed table stick further out than this, so that this is effectively acting like a power plane where you have wood coming in, you have the blade proud, and this side of the table is now equal to that blade. Therefore, you're going to get wood coming through. Whatever the difference between that surface and that surface is, with this blade parallel to this surface, you're going to get a cut. So I need to take this side of it off. What I intend to do now is to line the fence up and then place on the back of the fence these credit cards. And because these credit cards are made out of plastic and they're a uniform thickness and size, they'll act as a great spacer. Okay, so with the back of this fence packed out with credit cards along it, if I now put it back up again and reconnect the fence, so with this side of the fence sticking out now, I have the bearing flush with this side of the fence. But with this side of the fence here, if I bring it along, it actually touches the tip of the blade. But over here, if I bring that across there, can you see the gap that exists across there? So with this now set up in, shall we say, jointer mode, if we take this piece of wood with that kind of old, relatively, it's okay. If we want to smooth all of that down, watch this. Go up against there, like that. And that surface has now been reduced to that perfectly machine smooth flat surface. And you can see that that is absolutely completely flat. There's no rocking. It's perfect. So that is how to get a jointed edge on a router. This is a Makita miter saw, and it has the capacity to cut straight down. We can also change the angle and lock it off. Also the ability to incant the blade left or right, that can be done as well. That's all pretty normal stuff. But this is one of the tricks about this that I particularly like. On the side of this Makita is a little lever
this lever here. And what that allows you to do is that by selecting that lever across here, when the arm is pulled down, there is a restriction that stops the blade from achieving its full depth of cut. And with the obstruction, it can't make the blade go any lower.
So how can we take advantage of that? And why would that machine have that particular capability? Well, the first reason is that by being able to restrict how far you bring this down, it means that it could, for instance, allow you to place in, as I've made here, a zero clearance insert board. And this zero clearance insert board fits up against this fence, is attached directly behind.
So by selecting the blade to a shallower cut, when the blade comes down now, that's the full depth of cut, and I'm not going to cut through my insert. If I was cutting this piece of wood, I could line that up a fraction of a millimetre by just moving that slightly over. Another use of the machine is that with the blade restriction set to that as a maximum depth, it means that the distance between here and here can be adjusted by simply turning an adjuster knob. So you can see I'm making the gap bigger, and if I turn it to the left, the blade goes lower down.
So now that we know how to adjust the height of the blade so that we can determine how high the blade goes, and the fact that we can go in and out, it means that we can effectively now cut dados directly off the chop saw. Watch this. So there is a clean cut dado. And you can imagine that there are a number of uses that you could make out of that. But that's a nice clean dado. Nice square, beautiful cuts. You could cut that out, you could chisel it, but imagine what you could do making cuts like that. On here, I keep my chargers pretty much in one place. So I've got a charger for the DeWalt batteries and one here for my head gear, which has got a little motor in the back of it. I've got a radio here, keep my company. And here, probably one of the most important things is one of those lovely sort of like desk lamps, but I've got a daylight bulb in here. Gives a very clean white light, and it's very nice and helpful when you're trying to look up accurate dimensions and you can't see. Beneath it, we've got nail guns and a range of the different nails, brad nails that you would use to go with it. And there's a small pin gun that goes in there, and then next to those I've got all the pins. Beneath that I have got pocket screws and just an assortment of screws. So as you can see on the bottom shelf we've got a compressor. This particular compressor attracted me because it was quiet and it wasn't particularly bulky. I'm not particularly brand loyal to DeWalt, but I thought this was a very good compressor. Excellent for the nail guns, and one of the other primary functions for it is to sit here with an air gun on the end of it and clean stuff. So probably one of the most important tools in any workshop is a good workbench, a good place to work, and obviously mine is no exception. Made this particular workbench probably about 3 years ago and made it over probably a couple of months. It started off with a torsion box on the top here, and it was sitting on a couple of sawhorses on either side. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the torsion box, it's basically 2 sheets of flat MDF, in this case MDF, and then with a honeycomb between, it's then glued and screwed together. It makes it extremely rigid and very flat, very, very strong, so it's an ideal work surface because it doesn't distort and it maintains its shape. And then I actually flipped it upside down when it was on the sawhorses, and then actually constructed this lot upside down and before flipping it back, and that end drawers and cupboards to it. It's symmetrical, as you can see, 3 drawers on either side and a cupboard in the middle. Initially the cupboard was going to be used for space for myself to get my knees underneath, but there's a sufficient overhang on the top to make that sort of superfluous. Ironically enough, when I was building this, I could only buy a set of 5 full extension drawer slides, and frustrated by that and unable to get a final set, I decided the only way around that was to build 5 drawers. So this is a fake drawer over here. I'll show you that one shortly. And the original leg space here, which was turned into a cupboard, I've used for other things, which I'll show you as well. This is actually a fake front. It's just the one drawer. And I put in here the things that are very large and bulky that I couldn't get in a shallow drawer. This is specifically for hand tools, so let's take a look at this drawer in detail.
A closer look and you'll notice that all of the tools in there are in their own specific place. I've actually made jigs for everything to sit in, so you can see I've got dovetail saws there. I've got a drawer specifically for marking and measuring tools. Down here I made a jig that sits all the screwdrivers in, and then there's just a very simple tray with a couple of bits of timber separating all the planes that I've got. And the idea being is that by keeping the drawer in this particular configuration, it means that there's no one thing on top of another. Whenever you open the door, you get full access to what you want. I think it's better for the tools, and I think it just makes it a more organised and sensible place to store your hand tools. So the central cupboard, which was originally a leg space and subsequently deemed superfluous, has been turned into a cupboard. In order to make that cupboard usable, because it's got quite a deep back to it, I thought, well, I could put drawers in it. But then I had a bulkier item which I thought would be accommodated very nicely by this particular aperture. So I made some doors, and if you open the doors up, I've got here a nice full extension slide, and out comes a tool neck sharpening station. It's a very sensitive tool, and I really wouldn't want to hit this with anything or damage it. So this is a very useful place to put it, and so that's where it lives, in there. I think at a later date I might actually put an extension drawer up there, a very shallow one, and use that to accommodate the other sharpening stuff that goes along with it. The drawer to the left of the workstation is pretty much measuring and marking. There are some hand tools in there, you know, pliers and what have you, and some set squares, and a hammer and gloves and punches. But generally speaking, that drawer is used for just marking stuff out. There's blades and what have you in there, and it's nice to know, you know, whenever you're looking for a pencil, and I can always go to the pencils over there, or if I want measuring tools over there, or I've got set squares down here and a calculator and so on and so forth. So beneath that drawer we have got a sharpening drawer, and I've got a sharpening station in there. So this is ideal for sharpening chisels and plane blades. In the top right hand side we've got a nice jig for pocket holes, and there's just jigs down on the right hand side there for sharpening. So in contrast to that organisation, if you look down in the bottom drawer here, you'll see what happens when you allow yourself to just go wild. So that is an assortment of odds and sods, some to do with metalwork, mostly to do with woodwork, but it's been completely unorganised, and for a good reason. I don't use it. The stuff in there is very, very occasionally used. I don't often use glue guns, and I don't often use hand files, but if I do, I know where to come and find it. So for that purpose, I didn't bother to organise it any better. And finally, to the left of my workbench is probably where my major storage is for hand tools. So let's take a look at that in detail. So as you can see on the top shelf, I've got all of the glues and waxes and other lotions and potions that are useful in the workshop. On the second shelf, we've got DeWalt cordless stuff. I stick to one brand really because it means I can share the batteries. If we come down here, we've got power tools on power cables, and if we go below that, we've got an assortment of other power tools, and down at the bottom there we've got an old sharpening stone that's in that green tub. This is my dovetail jig. I made a nice box to put all the bits and pieces in,
and thought, well, it's got bits sticking off it, so it's a great place to store some more jigs and then hang bits and pieces off. And I've also got my my nice respirator and mask on the top there. Below that is the first chop saw that I had, and I leave it there in case I have to go out and do work outside the house. And beneath it is a bandsaw. That's probably the next tool that needs upgrading in this particular workshop. I think all of us need some inspiration, and I get my inspiration from Norm Abrams up there. I used to love watching the New Yankee Workshop, as a lot of us have, and I know there's a load of people out there that feel the same way that I do about him. So thank you, Norm. You've had a big impact on my life. One of the other things that I like to do is to draw and design things that I'm in the process of making or have made or I'm going to make. I find it inspires me. There's a nice design that I did a while back, which I have the planning permission to actually put the extension on the bottom side of the house. You can see this section here. In fact, we're in that room there, and the idea is to knock down the very wall that we're looking at the moment in order to join that. But I think, like most of us, a bit of a pipe dream really. I haven't got the money for it. That's a garage that I've got planning permission for. I had originally designed it to look like that, but was unable to get what I wanted. Again, can't afford to do that either. It's an internal toilet door that I've got to build for my brother. That was some alpine shutters that I put up, and actually that's a video that you can watch now. That's the front room, and that's going to be a great job. Looking forward to doing that one. That picture's up there because I like the look of it, and it also shows how very, very simple carpentry and joinery can be very effective. Those are probably the simplest drawer fronts that you could possibly have, so I'm inspired by those. Here's a plant table. I think it's a plant table. It's what my girlfriend's asked me to make for her. It's got a sturdy little top, and it's got a second shelf so I can put a smaller plant on it. So if we take a closer look at this, this will give a perfect example of how I use the tools in this workshop to not only use the tools for their primary function, but also in their secondary function. So with the table turned upside down, you can see that I started off with basically a 4x2. I mean, this is an offcut, but I've actually cut some of the side off it. And by cutting the 4x2 in effectively 4 on the table saw in its normal configuration, I ended up with 4 blanks to give me that shape. And then when I had that done, I had pretty rough sides, so I ran each side through the router table, but in jointer mode in order to get smooth sides. If you then look there, you can see how the table saw, but in dado mode, has ploughed out that dado on either side, and that produced a fantastically accurate finish. On the ends here, I've needed to produce mortises. I could have used the hollow chisel mortiser, but as you can see, they're very shallow, and I thought it was easier to produce them on the router table in router mode. So you can see the telltale signs of a mortise that's been produced on a router table because it's got a rounded end. This is the cross member at the bottom, originally cut out of one of these 4x2s. The table saw is used in order to get right thickness and the width. It's then run through the router table in jointer mode in order to get you a nice smooth surface. If you look down here, there's a profile that's obviously produced on the router table in normal mode. And if I turn it sideways, I ran this through the dado stack and then turned it around and ran it through in order to get a tenon. That was done in one pass, and because it was run through and turned around and run through again, by definition that ends up being perfectly in the middle. Even though this is upside down, this is effectively like the lower shelf. And this is completely flat, but it started its life out off from this board. And you can see just how cupped that board is. And so I ran that through the table saw and cut it there and there in order to produce 3 pieces of timber that were pretty much exactly the same width. Problem with that is that At the end of that, you end up with 3 slivers of wood that are relatively speaking flat, but the edges of them have got funny angles. So again, back to the router table in jointer mode, run those through, get perfectly flat boards, and that allows you to then glue those boards together. And this is the net result. This is 5 pieces of that wood cut into strips glued together, and I think you'll agree it's as flat as is necessary and it looks good. So if you've made it all the way through to the end of this video, I thank you for your patience and commitment. It's very kind of you. I hope it inspires you and that you've maybe picked up some tips and tricks. Those of you with small workshops that don't have the space or the money to afford a full-size table saw might be heartened by the fact that I'm using just a little job site table saw. And look at what a great job it does. It's cutting dados. Conversely, with the hollow chisel Mortiser, again, not exactly the most popular tool in the workshop, but look what a great job it does in cutting with a drill chuck fitted. Again, a more common item is probably the router table, but look what a great job it does as a jointer. So with that said, thanks very much indeed once again, and look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.